now going to start the first of two of the afternoon sessions of the symposium. My name is Cyrus Rastamji. I'm the Director of Economic Affairs Division at the Commonwealth Secretariat. My great pleasure to be here. This session is about strengthening LDC and emerging economies partnership, and more broadly, partnerships. Before I start talking about the policy theme from the perspective of policy, let me say that this initiative itself is a partnership in which the Commonwealth Secretariat is really very delighted to have been part of with the OECD, CPD, TESEF, and ICCID. It's wonderful to have such partnerships. I hope it's been fruitful for the participants, certainly for the practitioners, the development partners themselves. We find this to be an excellent form of cooperation and collaboration, bringing comparative advantage from each institution to bear. I very much hope that it will be pursued and strengthened as we go and continue in this vein. This session is about partnerships, and we had initially had 6 panelists for the session. We have an apology from Ekrem Yener, who's Chief International Expansion Officer at Turkcell. He is unfortunately being detained elsewhere and is unable to join us today. We also have the Honorable Sorasak Pan, who is Secretary of State of the Ministry of Commerce of Cambodia. He's advised that he's delayed a little. He will be joining us a little later and will hopefully be able to join the panel during the time we have allocated. There is another panel discussion later in the afternoon. We'll obviously have to conclude by our allotted time, but hopefully he'll be able to join us prior to that. And then we have 4 other distinguished panelists for this session. Dr. George Mavrotas, who is the Chief Economist of Global Development Network. He's the author and co-author of some over 100 esteemed publications in recognized journals and publications, with extensive work with donor agencies and developing country governments on many, many development issues. And I think a version of the bio would have been circulated. We have Suchat Katima, who is Executive Director of the Mekong Institute. He also spent 6 years at the Mekong River Commission and served as Chief of Human Resource Development and Regional Capacity Building there. He is a specialist in regional development and development economics, as many of you may well know, and specialist in designing capacity building programs, and really the input will be very, very valuable for us. We also have Dr. Helmut Reysen, Head of Research at OECD Development Center, also Counselor to the Director of OECD Development Center, worked extensively on global aid architecture, on the impact of China on poor developing countries, very much an issue that applies in the context of our discussion this afternoon, and the insights there will be extremely valuable. And also major analytical work and academic work on, and member of the editorial boards of many esteemed international journals. And we also have Dr. Mustafa Sahil, who is the Vice President of the Turkish International Cooperation and Development Agency, TICA. I think I pronounced TICA correctly, I hope. Since March 2007, an expert on EU relations with Turkey. Of course, that is a partnership in itself. Has worked very extensively on development cooperation and specialization with the UNDP. So we have a really excellent, extraordinarily powerful panel of speakers. We started slightly late, I think with recouped time. I wanted to make a few initial comments, if I may, and then ask the panelists to contribute. This morning, Ana Luisa set out several of the elements of the Istanbul Programme of Action as they seem to be evolving. For example, the objective of trying to reach 7% growth, building human resource capacity, reducing the vulnerability of LDCs to economic and environmental and social challenges, ensuring finance for development. And earlier this morning we also had two very, very interesting sessions on implementing and monitoring of LDC outcomes and on enhancing trade capacities. Now we're focusing on partnerships, and clearly, even if we get the recipes right for those two earlier sets of challenges, the forging of effective partnerships that deliver for LDCs in the next decade is going to be utterly crucial. If we consider 10 years ago, if we were having a panel discussion on strengthening LDCs and partnerships, we would have been confronted with an entirely different world. We've been confronted with a world where growth was a unipolar, western and northern type of growth. Aid was coming from a very discernible set of sources. The sources of trade for LDCs were quite clearly in the north and the west. The flows of finance were quite clearly, unambiguously from the north. And partners themselves were northern partners. And that was the framework of a discourse on partnership 10 years ago. Today and for the next 10 years, it's an entirely different framework of partnerships. We have, as was mentioned earlier today, the development working group of the G20 and the Seoul Consensus, which very explicitly, even in the G20, recognizes the importance of partnerships with non-G20 members. We have a trade which is diversifying rapidly, as we heard earlier today. We have growth in an absolutely multipolar world, China and India, but so many others as well, with whom the LDC group is trading. We have a very explicit thesis that has developed recently through the World Bank, the multipolar growth framework and orientation, which is bringing in new thinking about infrastructure investment and all sorts of other new dimensions to World Bank thinking in this context. FDI flows and sources are expanding and precipitating the need for altogether new types of partnerships. The linkages between aid and FDI are now becoming much more blurred in a new multipolar growth and global environment. And the sources of financing for development are now way beyond what we understood them to be a decade ago. It's no longer the IMF, World Bank, and some regional development banks, or the G7 industrial countries spurring the financing for development. It's a source that spans every region of the world. So the orientation in which we're discussing partnerships has changed altogether. And we're discussing not only partnerships in the context of the framework, the discussion for the outcome document, but for the next 10 years when we've left Istanbul and the orientation of that partnership. The question is, what types of partnerships? How effective might they be? These would be the questions that we would want to try to tease out. How can they be sustained? How can we forge South-South partnerships, triangular partnerships, and so on? Just before I turn to the panelists, let me illustrate how challenging this concept we have found in the Secretariat to be. The study we've done on sub-Saharan African partnerships with India and China. And what have we found from that? An immense degree of complexity. We find that the sub-Saharan African countries' exports, only 8 countries in sub-Saharan Africa have account for 90% of the exports to China and India. So when we talk of partnerships with India and China, it's really for a very small concentrated core of countries. When we talk of inward investment to sub-Saharan Africa, we think of the great promise of inward investment from India and China, we find that only 8 countries account, in the Chinese case, for 75% of that inward investment. So it's not quite as easy as it may appear in the direction of flows. We find rapid aid coming into the continent, rapid escalation of aid, but we find it's increasingly tied. We find that aid and FDI are linked to each other, a very confused type of partnership. So we have a panel, a wonderful panel, to try to help us discern new pathways for partnerships. I guess I've spoken too long, but that's just to set the scene that there's a complex set of issues challenging LDCs in the next decade. With that, and bearing in mind that we will have Excellency Sarasa Pan, Secretary of State for Minister of Commerce in Cambodia, joining us hopefully a little later. Let me first ask Mustafa Sahin, Vice President of TICA, to give some remarks. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. Before starting to discuss the matters put forward in this symposium, I would like to thank organizers, you and the other panelists for their presentations. As we are in Turkey, I would like to start with a story of a very famous local historic figure, Nasreddin Hoca, who lived almost 8 centuries ago. One day, Hoca decides to mend the roof of his house. He starts his job on it, but he loses his balance and falls down. The entire neighborhood gathers around him and present their all well wishes. But he wasn't pleased. He then exclaims, "Call me someone who fell down from a roof before. He is the one who can understand me better." So the South-South cooperation mentality is the same. We understand each other better than any other partners because we were there. Having been an aid recipient country herself in the past, Turkey is familiar with the problems of developing countries as well as their real needs. Geographic location, economic and social reforms, as well as positive outcomes of the development process in recent years made Turkey as an important partner in solving the problems of the LDCs. Perhaps here it is better for me to give some information about the Turkish International Cooperation and Development Agency, TICA, which is TICA where I work as a Vice President. TICA was established within the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1992, immediately after the dissolution of Soviet Union and former Yugoslavia, in order to assist the newly independent states in their transformation towards market-based democratic states. Currently, TICA is affiliated with the Prime Minister's office via a Minister of State. Being Turkey's official development agency for delivering development assistance, TICA is the principal institution for coordinating the flow of Turkish official development assistance alongside with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. In 2005, TICA was also given the duty of collecting data on the outflow of Turkish development assistance. While delivering aid to partner countries, Turkey feels a responsibility for sharing experience and know-how on areas where considerable achievements have been made. Being a country transformed from an agriculture-based economy to a trade and industry-based economy, Turkey has a lot to share with the countries that are following the same process with regard to globalization. This transfer of experience and know-how was initially aimed at Central Asia, the Caucasus and the Balkans. However, in recent years, Turkey has started to focus on assisting the least developed countries, especially Afghanistan and African countries, in their struggle against poverty and the development of infrastructure. Over the years, Turkish ODA increased considerably. For instance,